Welcome to the Biblical Roots of the Mass. This series of talks is part of the year of Sunday Mass, which is the second yearly theme of the pastoral plan of the Archdiocese of Chicago. In that pastoral plan, July 2012 through June 2013 has been designated the year of Sunday Mass. This year of Sunday Mass will coincide with the Universal Church's Year of Faith, which celebrates the 50th anniversary of the opening of the Second Vatican Council, whose Constitution on Sacred Liturgy brought about the ritual of the Mass that we celebrate today. In this series, I will examine the origin and development of the Roman rite of the Eucharistic liturgy, with a particular interest in the biblical texts that underlie the various prayers used in the Roman liturgy. With the implementation of the third edition of the Roman Missal in English last November, there has been a great impetus to study the prayers of the liturgy of the Roman Rite and examine the biblical texts that have given rise to many of those prayers. In the introductory session, we're going to look at the development of the liturgy in the early church and look at various terms that have been employed to describe it. Through the centuries, the Mass of the Roman Rite has come to be divided into four major sections. These are the Introductory Rites, where the congregation is called to prayer. This rite is followed by the Liturgy of the Word, which is also known as the Mass of the Catechumens in the patristic and early medieval period. The third division, which many would consider to be the most important, is the Liturgy of the Eucharist. This was known as the Mass of the Faithful in the patristic and early medieval period. The final part of the Mass is the concluding rites, where the congregation is sent forth to proclaim the Word and put it into practice, in addition to the lessons learned in the liturgy. The origins of the Roman liturgy, as the origins of the liturgies of all the rites that we have in the Church, are to be found in the New Testament, and in particular in the accounts of what has come to be known as the institution narrative at the Last Supper, found in Matthew, Mark, and Luke's Gospels, and in the first letter of Paul to the Corinthians. At the end of the Last Supper, Jesus gave his assembled disciples the command, "Do this in memory of me." Luke 22:19, 1 Corinthians 11:24. This meant that the apostles were to take bread and wine, as Jesus did at the Last Supper, say the words of institution, and distribute the body and blood of Christ to the assembled congregation. The earliest record of this command being fulfilled is found in the second chapter of the Acts of the Apostles, verse 46, which describes the routine of the early followers of Jesus. Day by day, they devoted themselves to meeting together in the temple area. Having been baptized as followers of Jesus Christ, these community members did not see any contradiction in continuing to practice their Judaism, praying in the temple and in the synagogue. These actions, Acts tells us, they did with one accord. The formal synagogue service was centered on the Hebrew Scriptures, which were proclaimed and commented on in the course of the service. The structure of the synagogue service became the rough structure of our Liturgy of the Word. The record goes on to say that they devoted themselves to breaking bread in their homes. This would be a reference to the command given in Luke and in 1 Corinthians at the Last Supper. As Jesus has broke bread with his disciples, so the early community gathers to do what he did, breaking bread with each other. This would be making present once again the presence of the risen Lord through the proclamation of the institution narrative found in the Gospel accounts of the Last Supper. Thus, there is a connection to the Jewish Passover meal through the Last Supper. The basic structure of the Passover meal became the structure for what we call the Liturgy of the Eucharist. We can therefore say that based on Acts, the early developing liturgy of the Mass was a synagogue service joined to a Passover meal celebrated at home. Thus, the Eucharistic liturgy developed from the early Church's Jewish roots. In a similar manner, the developing threefold office that we see in the pastoral epistles, and further developed in the letters of Ignatius of Antioch, has significant roots in Judaism. The pastoral letters give evidence for the development of two offices: episkopos, or bishop, who is the leader of a church, and deacon, who is an assistant to the episkopos. Later, Ignatius of Antioch gives evidence for a third office, that of presbyteros, or elder, also known as priest, who takes on some of the tasks of the episkopoi as the church grows. Through the research of James T. Burchell, these three offices are seen to have their origins in the Jewish synagogue structure. The episkopos is equivalent to the archisynagogos, or the leader or head of the synagogue. The deacon, or the assistant, is equivalent to the hadzan, who took the role of assistant in the synagogue service and assisted the others in the day-to-day operation of the synagogue. The presbyteroi, or elders, are equivalent to the gerousia, or the council of elders, who handle the operation of the synagogue and its community. Thus, in personnel and ritual, the developing Christian liturgy has its older sibling Judaism to thank. We now turn to the nomenclature, or naming conventions, which have been used for describing the liturgy of the Catholic Church. Put simply, the question is, how did our liturgy get to be called the Mass? From the history of the Roman liturgy, we discover that the earliest names for the liturgy originated in the Eastern or Greek-speaking part of the Roman Empire. Again, from the Acts of the Apostles 2:42 and 2:46, we get the earliest name for the liturgy, the breaking of the bread, the klassis artu in Greek. From earliest time, a distinction was made between the consecrated elements, the bread and wine, and the entire ritual action during which they were consecrated. At the time of Clement of Rome, in the early 2nd century, the term Eucharistein was used in connection with the ritual action or liturgy. Clement says, "Seeing therefore that we have all these things from him, we ought in every respect to give him thanks, Eucharistein, to whom be glory forever and ever. Amen." First letter of Clement 38:4. The giving thanks in every aspect or every respect includes the ritual action of breaking bread. In other places, Clement prefers to refer to that action as liturgia, from which we get the English term liturgy, translated as services, in the first letter to the Corinthians 40:2 and 5, or prosphora, literally something that is brought forward, translated as offerings, from Clement's first letter to the Corinthians 2:4. Justin Martyr speaks in the same sense, and this food is called among us Eucharistia, or Eucharist, of which no one is allowed to partake but the man who believes that the things which we teach are true, and who is so living as Christ has enjoined. This clearly refers to the elements which are consecrated to become the body and blood of Christ. The term Eucharistia is soon transliterated from Greek into Latin, Eucharistia, as we find in the writings of the Latin father Tertullian. This term Eucharist becomes the normal name for the sacrament of the body and blood of Christ. By the 3rd century, Christians have become a large part of the population of the Western Empire, despite the fact that persecutions continued throughout most of that century. Many of the Greek terms used to describe the liturgy are now translated, rather than transliterated, into Latin. Thus, Eucharistia becomes gratiarum actio, or the action of giving thanks. Eulogia becomes the benedictio, or blessing. It was at this time that the technical term Eucharistia in Greek for the ritual action was replaced by the Latin term oblatio, or offering. Thus, the key term used in the first centuries of the Church was now transliterated into Latin, but also replaced with another Latin term. In the West, another term was beginning to gain popularity. St. Ambrose, in writing to his sister, described troubles with the Arians around 385 or 386. In particular, addressing the soldiers sent to break up services in his church, he says, quote, "There I was told suddenly that they had sent soldiers to the Porciana Basilica. But I remained at my place and began to say Mass, missam facere cepi. While I was offering, dum offero, I hear that a certain Castulus has been seized by the people." What's significant here is that the Latin term missa is used to refer to the ritual action. Missam facere cepi, that is, I began to say Mass. This is a totally new use of the term. From the rest of the letter, the term Missa refers to what we call the liturgy of the Eucharist. The catechumens had been dismissed. The Latin term Missa derives from the verb mitto, which means to send. Hence, Missa refers to ascending. Augustine also used it to refer to a sending out of the catechumens before the liturgy of the Eucharist. Post sermonum, he says, fit missa catechumenorum, translated, after the sermon, the dismissal of the catechumens occurs. The 6th century Synod of Lerida in Spain in 524 declared that people could be admitted to the church usque ad missam catechumenorum, that is, until the catechumens are dismissed. As can be seen, the term Missa comes to be used in reference to the Eucharistic service or some part of it. By the late 6th or 7th century, the term was being used in the Gelasian sacramentary in such titles as Missa Chrismatus, the Chrism Mass, or Orationes ad Missa, orations at Mass. Yet it never loses its sense of dismissal. At the end of the Eucharistic liturgy, the command ite missa est is translated literally, go, the dismissal is made. In the Middle Ages and beyond, missa est became a regular form for dismissing people at the end of a legal procedure. This was then applied to the 2 dismissals in the course of the Roman liturgy. The dismissal of the catechumens after the homily before the action of the sacrament, and the dismissal of the faithful at the end of the liturgy after the consecration and communion. Gradually, the meaning of missa catechumenorum and missa fidelium changed from the dismissal action to the entire service, producing the names for the 2 halves of the liturgy which were used until the revisions of the Second Vatican Council. The Missa Catechumenorum became the Mass of the catechumens, and the Missa Fidelium became the Mass of the faithful. As the catechumenate fell into disuse, the term Missa or Mass was used to refer to the whole liturgical action from beginning to end. It should be noted that Mass has been used as a name for the Eucharistic liturgy in the Latin or Western rites only. It's never applied to an Eastern Rite liturgy. The Eastern Rite liturgies are referred to as the liturgy, as in the Divine Liturgy of St. John Chrysostom. To speak of an Eastern liturgy as a Mass is incorrect. So we've looked at the development of the Mass from the Jewish synagogue service and the Passover meal. We saw how the major ministers of the Mass are related to the leaders of the Jewish services. And we examined the historical development of the name Mass for the Eucharistic liturgy. In the next session, we'll begin to examine the ritual of the Mass in more detail, paying particular attention to the biblical references that occur. We'll begin with the introductory rites, especially the sign of the cross, the greeting, and the penitential rite.